I've been asked to talk about issues in learner autonomy. For me, there are essentially three. The first issue is, how do we understand the concept? What exactly do we mean when we talk about learner autonomy? The second issue has to do with pedagogical implementation, and the third with finding appropriate focuses for research. So let me say a little about each of those in turn. Beginning with understanding the concept. I first came across the term learner autonomy at the end of the 1970s, when the Council of Europe published Henri Olek's report, Autonomy and Foreign Language Learning. Recently made responsible for the language laboratories in my university, I was keen to exploit their potential for self-access learning, and I set about providing an extensive array of materials in the languages of the university curriculum and in some 24 other languages besides. I assumed that our students would readily conform to Olek's definition of the autonomous learner as one capable of taking charge of all aspects of his or her learning. It would be wrong to give the impression that our self-access resources were never used. We always had a small number of loyal and persistent clients. But the idea of self-access learning was completely alien to the majority of students. They saw no point in using the resources, and when, as occasionally happened, they were required to do so by one of their lecturers, they had little idea how to proceed. But how could it be otherwise? Their previous educational experience had been entirely teacher-led, and they firmly believed that educational success depended on following the teacher's instructions. This seemed to me an unsatisfactory state of affairs, especially at a university, and I set about trying to remedy it. I established an experimental self-access course in German for students of engineering, providing them with an advisory service and regular opportunities to interact with German native speakers. At that stage, my only concern was to help students to make better use of our self-access resources by better managing their own learning. I understood learner autonomy as an essentially organizational capacity. My German experiment was progressing nicely when I attended a seminar given by Leni Damm, a teacher of English at a Danish middle school who was becoming well known internationally for promoting learner autonomy in her classroom. She explained how she got her teenage learners to take charge of their learning. To begin with, starting in the very first lesson, she made them think. How much English did they already know? In those days, the mid-1980s, it was often no more than a few words and phrases. Why were they learning English? What kind of activities did they think were likely to help them learn? What use could they make of the language, not at some unspecified time in the future, but here and now, in the English classroom and in the world outside? Even if she made them think, Leni required them to choose. How to learn the English words that were important to them, what to do for homework, which of their classmates to work with, which learning activities to pursue in group work, and so on. And from the very beginning, she spoke to her learners entirely in English, putting them under pressure to respond to her in English. Needless to say, in the early stages, most of what she said was accompanied by mime and gesture, and from time to time, she provided a brief gloss in Danish. Also needless to say, in those early stages, the English produced by her learners was strongly coloured by interference from their native Danish. But in a very real sense, Leni Damm's learners were users of English from the beginning. This was reinforced by the learning journals or logbooks in which they kept a record, again from the beginning and in English, of what they did in each lesson, and regularly reflected not only on what they'd learned, but on how they thought they'd learned it, and what they had and had not enjoyed. In a sense, everything I've written about learner autonomy over the past 20 years has been an attempt to understand it as the product of these and related pedagogical procedures. Whereas I'd begun by thinking of learner autonomy as a matter of self-management, my understanding now expanded to include continuous metacognitive engagement with the process and content of learning that was rooted in communicative use of the target language. So autonomy in language learning became inseparable from autonomy in language use. Doing full justice to these dimensions of the concept is, I think, the biggest challenge that self-access language learning schemes have to overcome. Let me say a little more about pedagogical practice. According to the understanding of learner autonomy I've just sketched, its development in the classroom requires a pedagogical approach that's driven by three principles of target language use, learner involvement, and learner reflection. I think of these three principles not as a hierarchy, but as three interacting perspectives on the same complex communicative phenomenon. If spontaneous use of the target language is central to successful language learning, it's important that learners are given access to a wide range of discourse roles, initiating as well as responding. Perhaps the most obvious way of achieving this is to involve them in forms of talk where they have to take responsibility and make decisions, the principle of learner involvement. But in order to be fully proficient in their target language, learners need to be able to turn the language back on itself in order to make evaluative judgments, which means that they need to engage in forms of oral interaction that are calculated gradually to develop their capacity to think in the target language, the principle of reflection. To talk in this way is not to describe a teaching method, but a general approach that becomes a method only when it's brought to bear on a specific teaching and learning environment. How exactly the approach is shaped into a method will always depend on the learners, their age, the level of proficiency, if any, that they already have in the target language, the curriculum they're following, the broader educational context, if any, in which they're learning. It will also depend on contextual variables, the size of classes, the way in which the classroom is furnished and equipped, the resources available to teacher and learners in the classroom and outside, and so on. Though having said that, there were close similarities between what happened in Leni Dunn's classroom from the mid-1980s on and what happened in the classrooms of an English language school for adult refugees in Ireland, for which I was responsible from 2000 to 2008. It's sometimes assumed that this approach is a matter of giving learners choice and getting them to communicate with one another in the target language, a permissive version, if you like, of the direct method. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. Because the learners are engaged from the very beginning in planning, monitoring, and evaluating their own learning, the focus of their target language use is constantly shuffling backwards and forwards between invention and analysis. And because they write things down in their logbooks, but also on posters that are pinned to the classroom wall, the written language plays a central role in all their activity. Written language is used to capture the outcome of their group work, which may be the text of a short play, or a story, or an account of some feature of target language culture that intersects with their interests. In other words, writing is used to capture, but also refine and abbreviate speaking. At the same time, what learners write down can be used in a variety of ways to support their efforts to speak the target language. Posters on the classroom wall may, for instance, provide them with keywords and phrases relevant to the project they're working on, or remind them of useful idioms. And when their project is to write a short play that they will perform in front of the rest of the class, oral negotiation generates a first draft of the play, rehearsal suggests the need for revision, and determination to write the best play possible prompts a focus on appropriate word choice and grammatical accuracy. The continuous movement back and forth between invention and analysis, speaking and writing, means that although learners' first priority is to understand and communicate meaning, linguistic form is never far from their minds. And at more advanced levels, their projects may focus explicitly on linguistic analysis of one kind or another. For example, a class of teenagers may decide to read one of the Harry Potter novels together, and then compile their own glossary of terms specific to the ethos and activities of Hogwarts School. This approach to language teaching and learning requires access to two kinds of target language resource: reference materials, especially dictionaries and grammars, appropriate to the age and proficiency level of the learners, and authentic materials that provide them with the input they need in order to invent their own texts. Nowadays, of course, the Internet can provide both kinds of resource in sometimes embarrassing profusion. What about textbooks? Leni Dum's first visit to Dublin was financed from the profits generated by a series of 3 French textbooks that came out of a project to introduce communicative language teaching to Irish schools. So it was somewhat deflating to discover that she herself did not use a textbook, was indeed hostile to the very idea of textbooks. The reason was obvious enough. Language textbooks are scripts for learning that someone else has written, which means that they seek to teach language from the outside in. Leni Dum's approach, by direct contrast, sought from the very beginning to engage learners' sense of themselves and their identity, to get them to learn English, as it were, from the inside out. Now, it's by no means impossible to do this using a textbook as a resource. Many years ago, Michael Legutke published an article describing how learners of German at a high school in the United States used their textbook to construct an imaginary German-speaking society in which each member of the class had an alternative identity. In this way, from the outside in was converted into from the inside out. But still, it will always be necessary to engage learners prior to and also beyond the textbook. The communicative activities that Leni Dum's learners engaged in were such that the English words and phrases they learned were the words and phrases they wanted to learn because they needed them to fulfill their various communicative purposes. As a result, already at the end of their first year of learning English, most of them had a mental lexicon that included a number of nouns and adjectives they would never have found in a textbook written for learners at their level. We had a similar experience teaching English to adult refugees in Dublin. Our learners compiled their own lists of vocabulary to learn on an almost daily basis, and one of their favourite activities was to devise vocabulary tests for one another at the end of each week. One learner, working towards A2, the second proficiency level defined by the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, included the following words in his list: therapy, blood pressure, inflamed, tablets, temperature, dehydrated, dizzy, headache, health, sick, ill. Because one of the things he sometimes had to do was take a sick child to the doctor. His list also included assessment, self-assessment, organize, learn, theme, topic, project, because he needed to be able to talk about the autonomous approach to learning that we'd introduced him to. It's fairly certain that few, if any, of these words appear in EFL textbooks for adult learners aiming for level A2. Let me move now from pedagogical practice to research. What I've written about learner autonomy has always moved from practice to theory. That is, my starting point has been close familiarity with forms of pedagogical practice that successfully harness the capacity for autonomous behavior that all learners bring with them to the classroom. For many years, my own research agenda was driven by the desire to explore that practice from a variety of established theoretical perspectives. I've recently read it claimed that work in learner autonomy is undergoing a social turn. Well, it's always been clear to me that learner autonomy is the product of processes in which the social interactive frames, stimulates and supports the individual cognitive. As I wrote as long ago as 1991, autonomy is not autism. At an early stage, it dawned on me that two of Vygotsky's key ideas could illuminate what was happening in the group work that plays a central role in the autonomous classroom. The zone of proximal development provides a metaphor with which to explore how learners support one another in their learning, while the argument that inner speech develops out of social speech via egocentric speech helps to explain the early development of a capacity for metacognitive talk in the target language. Levenwenger's community of practice provides another basis for exploring what is happening in the autonomous classroom, this time in terms of their apprenticeship metaphor. Dialogic pedagogy provides a third perspective. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Neil Mercer, Robin Alexander, and Eugene Matuzov, none of whom is concerned primarily with second or foreign language learning. And it's worth noting here as an aside that Leni Dam derived the theoretical underpinning for her approach from Douglas Barnes's 1976 book, From Communication to Curriculum, which said many pioneering things about the construction of knowledge in classrooms that give space to exploratory talk, but which again was not concerned with second or foreign language teaching, but with education in the mother tongue. The various research traditions on which I've drawn in the attempt to enhance my theoretical understanding of learner autonomy in practice can also provide us with models for empirical exploration, as can mainstream SLA research methods. It's not always easy to gather evidence that allows worthwhile comparison between the learning outcomes in autonomous and non-autonomous language classrooms. But some years ago, Linhard Legenhausen was able to do just that, comparing the lexical, syntactic and conversational development of Leni Dam's learners with beginning learners of English in a German gymnasium. He found that after 30 lessons, Dam's learners had access to a larger vocabulary than their German peers, whose vocabulary derived exclusively from their textbook. That Dam's learners used a wider range of grammatical structures, and perhaps most importantly, that when after 18 months of learning they were asked to talk in pairs about a topic of their own choice, the German learners produced stilted conversational exchanges dominated by textbook phrases, whereas Dam's learners showed themselves capable of more authentic communicative behavior. There's always plenty of room for more research of this kind. Because for me, autonomy in language learning and autonomy in language use are two sides of the same coin, I've never been convinced of the usefulness of research that attempts to measure learners' autonomy as such. according to my own pedagogical experience, autonomous learners are successful language learners. And the best way of confirming this is by assessing their communicative proficiency in the target language. Research that claims to measure learners' autonomy independently of their target language proficiency seems to me misguided in its assumption that autonomy in language learning can easily be transferred to other domains of learning or indeed living. I've described the autonomous classroom as a place where learners move back and forth between invention, generating one or another kind of text in the target language, and analysis, planning, monitoring, and evaluating the process and content of their learning. The strong emphasis that such a classroom places on the development of learners' metacognitive capacities gives it something of the atmosphere of a laboratory. There's a sense in which autonomous learners are researchers of their own learning. And the things that teachers do to give shape and direction to that learning are effectively varieties of action research. There's no need for the learner autonomy research agenda to worry about whether or not learner autonomy works, because at least, as I've described it, it works by definition. We certainly need to know more about how it works, and thus how we should configure the different dynamics of learning that the autonomous classroom seeks to implement. But above all, we need to find ways of more effectively promoting learner autonomy on a larger scale. And this can be done only through processes of professional development that give teachers the capacity to research their own practice, even as they develop the research capacities of their learners. Let me briefly conclude. As I hope I've made clear, for me, language learner autonomy is constructed and enacted in classroom discourse that is authentically dialogic. Unremitting and uncompromising dialogic use of the target language ensures that language acquisition takes place. An unremitting and uncompromising insistence on learner involvement and learner reflection ensures that learners' target language repertoire is itself dialogically constituted, developing the internal metacognitive function in interaction with the external communicative function. When I contemplate the ever-expanding literature on learner autonomy, I can't escape the conclusion that this view of what learner autonomy is and how it can be developed is increasingly a minority view.